Like to start off with a land acknowledgement, and I think the history of land acknowledgements have come a long way. Even the fact that we do them shows progress and intention. I'm a member of the Northern Cheyenne tribe from Montana, but I'm fortunate to live and work in Anchorage, Alaska, which is on the traditional lands of the Dena'ina people. Some land acknowledgements, they say thanks for stewarding the land, and this is always, awkward for someone like me who is not from this area. Um, but I like to think about the history of the land and the people who have cared for it. And in the history, the more recent history of like the past 100 years, and the development of jurisdictions, policies, laws, and regulations that have been imposed on the indigenous people by settlers and outsiders such as myself. And so just recognizing, they lived in harmony with the land, they cared for the land cared for them. And so to think about my own actions and relationships with the land that I now live, and how I am honoring, protecting, and supporting the indigenous people of the land where I live. So I encourage all of you to think about the land where you are, learn about the history of the folks that have the indigenous folks who have lived there for generations, and their efforts to support and care for their land, the plants, the animals that have cared for them for generations. And so if you want, take a quick moment and drop in the chat your location and whose traditional lands you are joining us from. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Robert Kershaw and Ellison Myers from the StoryCenter. The StoryCenter is an international not-for-profit community arts organization rooted in the craft of storytelling since 1993. So Robert is the director of public workshops at the StoryCenter. He's been facilitating digital storytelling workshops and supporting community media projects since 2001. After working 7 years on rigs and offshore platforms, Rob moved to southern Alberta, where he worked as a writer, photographer, ranch hand, and co-owned an independent newspaper concerned with community development, regional history, and environmental issues in and around the Waterloon Glacier International Peace Park. So he is also an honored member of the Piikani Nation Buffalo Runner Society since 2000. And he's a graduate of the University of Calgary with the Bachelor's of Science in Ecology and Communication Studies. He now lives in Berkeley, California with his family. And so with Robert, Ellison Myers, she is the program director of the StoryCenter. Her background is as an artist, educator, community builder, lifelong appreciator of stories. And they've served her efforts to support community-centered storytelling projects all over the globe. She's joining the StoryCenter in 2008 and has almost 2 decades of personal and professional experience in international and cross-cultural settings, including 4 years as a program coordinator for the U.S. Department of State-funded International Exchange Program with Community College. She's also taught ESL and communications at Maricopa Community College Systems in Arizona. She has a Bachelor's of Art in Literature and Communication from Vanderbilt, and a Master's of Arts in Humanities in Intercultural Communication from UC University of Colorado in Denver. And right now she's joining us from Lisbon, Portugal. So welcome. And with that, I'll turn it over to Robert and Ellison.
Thank you, James, and thank all of you from wherever you're zooming in from. It's an honor to be here. When I always hear that I used to work on offshore rigs, I'm an unabashed apostate. And I actually had worked in Dead Horse years ago, even though I'm Canadian. I had a stint up there. So, but I was also a manager of a shoe store, but I leave that out of my bio. But, we all have long sort of trajectories into where we're at, and which is a nice sort of segue into storytelling as our own journeys and how we've learned and how we express our experiences through stories, whether it's to, a person across a table in friendly confines, or maybe it's an adversary and you're trying to sway them to your way of worldview. So without further ado, we'll get to it. And please continue putting in where you're at, where you're zooming in from, and who you are, and maybe who you're with, kind of like why you're here, like your interests, given maybe your work or your personal journeys, however you want to express yourself. And we'll use the chat as best we can. We'll try and get as much open mic. We'll see how hopefully people stay the duration. It's going to be, I think, an entertaining, engaging, provocative 90 minutes. We will have a couple of breaks because we know we need to do that in this online world. But please, the chat, Allison will be answering questions as we go. If there seems like it's a question that, needs to be raised into the voice, we will open mics and actually ask questions, or maybe Allison will. Jenna's going to be on my case if I'm running overtime. We want to be able to watch and hear some stories from people. We also want to have you answer some questions. And so we better get going if we're going to get all that covered. So let me share my slides. If you can't hear me or something's not showing up properly, again, please let us know. This is your, the presentations for you, and we want to make sure you are, we're honoring that. Okay. And let me go back to the beginning of my slides. So here we are, and I'm pretty excited to know that this is an ongoing series, and we're just part of many talks and presentations, and the learning that's coming through the NNA is quite remarkable. And when Anne contacted us, and I went to the website and I saw the guiding principles and the work you're doing, it was super exciting for me. So again, I'm really honored. I know Allison is too, to be here with you all. What we're going to try to do today is sort of three main parts. We just want to dig into story. That, I have this title. We put this title together: story as place, as knowing, as sharing. And I think some people maybe can understand the sort of, it feels a little, it's not a sentence or anything like that, but there's something about the place, the knowing, and the sharing I think is important in storytelling, especially when we're working in communities, and especially when we're working in communities that are not on our homelands. We also want to talk a bit about how at StoryCenter we facilitate the stories, and through that we will sort of raise these ideas of ethical principles which guide us in doing the best we can be in doing story work within communities as well as with individuals in our workshops. And then if there's time, Q&A. And there's going to be a survey at the end. So please stick around because it's just a short survey capturing your feedback. All right. So right out the gate, I want everybody to think about this question and this scenario, to think about a place in your life, not your home, not your work, but a third place. And it could be your home, but we're not going to identify it as such. Maybe it's some place special to you. And as you're thinking about that, what we want you to capture and put in the chat, what emotions, images, words, or phrases do this place evoke in you? I mean, James is telling me that he's going to be going fishing. So, and I don't know if it's going to be in some kind of a skiff or a raft, but I can imagine putting a boat on a river or in a lake is a third place for James, where there's something special to him about that. So that's what we're going to do. And let's just do a few minutes and just populate the chat with, and don't think too hard. You don't have to write too much, just words, emotions, phrases, memories. I'm going to do it too. Allison, we're all going to do this. Thank you for doing that. You know, sometimes when we talk about telling stories about place, we can get caught up in geography, and it's important. But when we're talking about storytelling, there's something else going on, right? It's more than just the information. It's more than just a latitude and a longitude and elevation. It's more than just the weather. There's something else that we're connecting to. And part of it in storytelling is trying to help people, first of all, honor those emotions, those evocations, and see in that space of memory what they want to express. People are still and keep writing. The other thing I want to talk about is sort of voice. We want to make sure that when we're thinking about stories, and since this is a workshop where people are working in communities and possibly communities that they take a plane to, and then from that airport, they take a smaller plane and they move out into more remote areas. This idea of who gets to tell stories and who needs to be the listener. And I just want to do this little anecdote. This is Charlie Barnaby. He is he passed away sadly a year ago in February. He was a mentor of mine, and he was at one time a chief of the Dene Nation up in the Northwest Territories of Canada. And I was up there very enthusiastic, wanting to gather stories from people and what we can do with these stories and publish them in websites. And I was very excited, but I kept talking about we. And this is Charlie with his kicker, and at his cabin, this is his cabin. Let's see if I can pull it up. This is also the place where because he had satellite up there, I watched the Twin Towers fall. So I was telling James and others the story. So the notion I was in this place when the Twin Towers fell in 9/11, 2001. But Charlie stopped me at some point. Now, he had listened to me sort of rattle on, and he said, "Rob, who is this royal we you keep talking about?" And that's all he had to say. So what it turned for me is like, I have my story to tell, but I should not be imposing my story. Certainly not on Charlie, and certainly not the people from the Dene Nation of the Satu. So it was just this moment of learning. So as we go through these stories, and as we think of our own stories, think about representation, think about it's my story, it's my journal entry, this idea of our story. So I just want to carry that through with that little anecdote. And it was and also think about the times when you learned through someone sitting you down and saying, "Rob, who's this royal we you keep talking about?" And that leads to this idea that storytelling, at least the way at StoryCenter we think about it, is about relationships. That stories are unique. It is the way that we take our experiences, the things that we have learned in our lives, the mistakes we have made, the successes we've had, and find ways to express them, to share them, to build relationships with others, to our worldviews, our opinions, and we do it through story. And that's how we navigate the world. It's sort of at a human level. So that's the other thing to think about. Think about whose voice you're hearing. Think about the relationships in the stories, and see if you can sort of open that up for your own sort of pondering. So this idea of relationships will be playing out in all these stories. It could be, that's why that little exercise about place. Right? We start expressing our relationship to a place, but of course can be to a friend, and it can also be to a foe, and it can also be to an idea, a point of view, an issue that's that's pressing on you personally or us as a civilization. But it's about the relationship, and just think about how stories are really how we can close the gap, or at least assert where we stand on an issue. All right. And just drilling down a little bit more to the work about storytelling, at least the way that we approach it. So we have these sort of ripple effects of what we think are stories and where are the stories that we want to pay attention to. Think about your own research. Think about, me as someone years ago that thought they'd be a research scientist, and you're probably all lucky that I didn't do that route. But this idea that the me story is this unique to me. My direct experience about things happen in my life, that experience with Charlie Barnaby is me. It's a little bit of my insecurities and all that. My story might be my point of view about any number of issues, but it's one of many. And so there's other perspectives, other points of view around something, but my story is one of many. And the other one is our story, which I think is what Charlie was trying to allude me to, that I was putting my story, my energies into a story that wasn't mine. So this honoring of the our story and the collective, and being paying attention and not tell their story. That's sort of that journalistic from observer trying to capture, maybe agendize some perspective. And the no story is just data. Although as researchers, maybe people can argue or, have a story to talk about how data is a story. There's the challenge. And so our interest really is in these sort of more central rings here in this ripple effect. The me story, the my story, and the our story. All right, we're going to watch some stories in a minute. But I'm going to read this quote. Or Allison, do you mind, or James, does someone want to read this? Oopsie, I didn't want to go. This is a lead into the first story. Who wants to read this? So I'm not always talking.
I'm happy to read it, unless
Thanks.
James is dying to read it. Stories as place. It happened at a meeting between a community in Northwest British Columbia and some government officials. The officials claimed the land for the government. The natives were astonished by the claim. They couldn't understand what these relative newcomers were talking about. Finally, one of the elders put what was bothering them in the form of a question. If this is your land, he asked, where are your stories? He spoke in English, but then he moved into Gitsan, the Tsimshian language of his people, and told a story.
I remember my excitement and the talk around town. The George River herd had come up here from the north to a few miles from Rigolette. The herd usually stays in the north down around Nain, maybe up to Postville, but rarely did any come this far south. People could now go hunting in the morning and be back in the community again before dark with caribou meat. Most other times they had to go hundreds of miles north and be gone for a week or longer. When we heard about the caribou being so close, my husband Maxwell, my grandson William, and me went to our cabin at Poppy's Head at Doublemere. Maxwell went out to get some firewood and came back saying caribou were blocking his way up the path. Before he could take William back to see the caribou, we heard the hooves hitting the snow. Next thing we know, the caribou came right up to the cabin. Then they turned around and left. We just watched them. I'd never seen that many caribou at one time. I remember the noise, like thunder. There was a time not too long ago, until maybe 20 years ago, when people used to hunt caribou in the Muley Mountains, which was closer to Rigolette than going far north. But the Muley Mountains are now a restricted area and people are no longer allowed to hunt there. People can still go north. Some may even go to Churchill Falls, but with price of gas, food, and parts for snowmobiles, it's really expensive to go on the hunt these days. Caribou is a big part of my family and my community. So if a year goes by without having any caribou meat, we really miss it. I hope someday the caribou come back like they did that one year.
just pause for a
Well,
second. Yeah, we'll read this. So what I want people to do here, just think about that story and answer these 3 questions. Why do you think Barbara was telling the story? Was why, when I say why now, where was the urgency? And who do you think is listening to this story? Or who do you think she was trying to speak to? Who is she talking to? And then I'll give you a bit more context. I'm just going to see what people say about the story. Thank you. Why this story? Why the story now? Why am I showing it? Another way of saying that. And who is this story for? All right, I'll give you some clues. So this was up in Rigolet. This is Eastern Arctic, Nunatsia. It was a climate change community health project. So one of the issues was they're primarily seal hunting traditionally, although again, that's part of the story, is so the ice comes in late, leaves early. So they were trying to capture stories about community health in relationship to climate change. And this is a workshop that not one person used the word climate change, but they talked a lot about access to land. And in this case, the 2 of the determining factors were restrictions on where, and also economics. There are other stories talking about they're busy in town, they don't have as much time. A lot of people don't even go to their cabins as much anymore. And yes, the ice comes in late and leaves early, so travel across lands can get difficult. But it was just really interesting that story and what the knowledge in that community was much deeper and broader than the research questions. So it was really interesting for the researchers to listen to these stories in this workshop that not one person mentioned the words climate change. Okay, Allison, keep going.
Yeah. All of a sudden, everyone understood, even though the government foresters didn't know a word of Gitsun, and neither did some of the Gitsun companions. But what they understood was more important: how stories give meaning and value to the places we call home, how they bring us close to the world we live in by taking us into a world of words, how they hold us together and at the same time keep us apart. They also understood the importance of the Gitsun language, especially to those who do not speak it.
This is a picture of the traditional trail map in the Satu region, Northwest Territories. All these data points and colors were all came about through community storytelling workshops to develop this wonderful map. And here's a story from that region.
As we arrive, we all start helping each other. The boys are getting wood. It's so good to see how the boys enjoy working and laughing with each other. As the young girls, they're helping me clean and getting fresh water from the lake. I'm also teaching them how to cook and sew. The next day, they all left to go back to town. I was left alone to myself. I just loved it. So peaceful, the sound from the wood stove, the birds singing, and the raven calling. I see the wind gently moving the trees. I feel so alive sitting by the window, the beauty of the Great Bear Lake, making me feel at home. I sat quietly sewing, thinking all about the worries we have when we're at home. It's so different when we're in the bush. As I sat by myself, I feel good about everything around me. Then I prepare for supper. As I cut meat, I look out the window. I see the skidoo lights coming back to the camp. After supper, I put on an old tape of the prophet story told by the Cecile Modest. I lie down on the wooden bed and watch 13 youth lying on the floor, not a whisper. Listen to the tapes in ordinary language. I will never forget that night. Again, so peaceful, the moonlight coming through the window like a blanket over all the kids. The sound of the wood stove. It's so comfortable. The next day, the kids have to leave, but they didn't want it to go. My family is with me later that night. All of a sudden, I see the skidoo lights again, and I'm thinking, what are they doing? They have come back to bring me pop, chips, bread, and cinnamon rolls. They are thanking me. I'm thankful for them because I know they appreciate the time we spent together. The lake, the moon, the sounds of birds, ravens, and fire. We shared it all.
Allison, before you read the last part of the quote, that is also the same funding as the Riglet story. So it was the same pool of money looking at slightly framed differently for this research project. So that story came out of that project. Does that, I think we need to go. Yeah. So the last quote, go ahead, Allison.
The language sounded strange. It made no sense to most of the people there, but its strangeness was somehow comforting, for it reminded them that stories always have something strange about them, and that this is what first takes hold of us, making us believe. Recognizing the strangeness in other people's stories, we see and hear it in our own. This is from If This Is Your Land, Where Are Your Stories?
We'll watch one more story, then we'll take a break. We're moving around now. This is the one that Allison, the project Allison coordinated with the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute in Seattle, Washington.
My name is Hate Francisco Black Bear, and I'm always hungry. I know 6 words so far, 6 words in Lakota. Waji, Nupa, Yamni, Topa, Zapta, and Shunka. Those means 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and dog. Sometimes, when we're in the van on the way to the skate park, my aunt teaches me. I don't ask, she just teaches me. Robert, the bus driver, starts it. He says, how do you say this, or how do you say that? And she tells us the words. And this is the class. The classroom is the bus. Actually, the classroom is everywhere. Last Christmas, when my uncle was out of jail, I got a skateboard. And we had a big dinner with all my stepbrothers and stepsisters. My mom and my grandma made pudding out of berries I picked with my stepsister. 22 pounds. 22 pounds of berries. It's sweet and nasty and you gotta have more of it. I'm always hungry. Wajapi, I say. And my aunt says that means berry pudding in Lakota. I didn't even know. Out of everything it could have meant. That's 7. 7 words. Robert asked me what my last name is. Black Bear, I say. And what do bears eat when they're hungry? Salmon, I say. What if there is no salmon, he asked. Berries, I say. The classroom is everywhere.
we don't need to see the last bit. It's just credits. We'll save this for after the break. Again, please think about those questions before you go on break or while you're on a break. Just your thoughts about the stories we saw, including Ethan McKenzie's, about the youth, all the stories, and see if things are starting to coalesce within you, thoughts, questions coming up while they're fresh in your mind. And then we'll take, is 5 minutes enough, Jenna? I think we're running about 5 minutes behind.
Yeah, that'll probably end up kind of going into things a bit, but also we understand if people need to just step away for a few minutes. So,
but please converse in the chat. Give us some thoughts, questions, concerns, anything that comes to mind. Thank you. I was going to move the deck around. I think trying to find out where I could put this story. All right. Stop share for a minute.
Robert, if you're ready, it's probably good to get things started again.
Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. A short break. We'll have another one. And this little section is not going to be as long. So let's start with another little fun exercise. This asks you to caption this image. So I think it's self-explanatory. Again, it could be what this photograph evokes in you, what you think it's saying, meaning, without context, How does this photo speak to you or not speak to you? And just put it in the chat, please. Thanks for doing that. Keep them coming if you're just starting to bubble up with you. It's a fun exercise because one of the things to recognize in this form of storytelling is that there's a visual component. And we're going to talk now a little bit about the process behind how those stories are put together. The main thing to take away right now is those stories were created by the people speaking the words. So these are so whether it was Edith or Barbara or Tate Francisco, they were stories through their own expressions and their own words, and working to choose their photographs. In the case of Tate, working with a facilitator, a collaborator on editing the videos of him in the van, because it's hard for him to shoot the video and then also try to find ways of expressing. So this idea that images also have power in this form of storytelling. But let's go walk through the process a little bit to give you a bit of context to how these stories put together. And Allison, please feel free. You have obviously as much experience as me in this process. But these are sort of the 5 areas that we try and facilitate. We try to create a space where people can reflect, thinking back into their experiences, making sense of those experiences. We'll talk a little bit more about how we do that, but it's this idea of reflection, writing without a capital W, but it's a way of expressing. Tate didn't write, he spoke. Some people will write, some people will not speak at all, some people will use text. But this idea that we're trying to get something that's in our heads out somehow, right? So there's a form of expression of the experience and a way of recording that. So in case of Tate, he was filmed in the van. So this idea of a recording, so we're taking it from words on a page to a sound of a voice, typically, right? So that's a big transition from things that are written with sentence structure and grammar to something that is expressed through voice, however that person wants their voice to be expressed. And then there's a component of production. So all that sort of the story that is now a digital recorded voice alongside of media that the storyteller has or will go take or will find and puts them together to create these short digital stories. And always in our workshop, just like we're celebrating and thanking the storytellers for giving Allison and myself permission to share these stories just in the context of this workshop, as well as on websites and wherever. And we'll talk about the pitfalls of sharing when we get to ethics. But there's always a celebration because we know that expressing ourselves and being creative in that expression is worth celebrating. We also want to make note that the process of making media, and we would say should be more important than the final product that emerges. We are all amateurs as filmmakers. We do not have film theory and years of experience. We don't have the big budgets. So people take this personally. They take it, right, as their own creative little endeavor. And we want to honor that. We want to make sure that that space honors them all the way through and be there to support, help, however they see fit. Because we know that is where the energy is being put. And of course, the celebration is exactly that. They know the effort they put in. And the
Rob,
shared...
I'm going to jump in as soon as you finish. There's a question in the chat.
Yeah.
So somebody was asking about the breakdown of the workshop. These were all done, like with youth workshops, we often take a little bit longer. Maybe it's 4 or 5 days. Maybe we do a lot more with photography. Our workshops generally are from 3 to 5 days when they're in person, like a 9 to 5 sort of thing. Now we do a lot of them online, and can be over 6 weeks where there's, 6 group sessions of a couple of hours, like every Monday for 2 hours. And then there's individual work that people do. And then there's one-on-one time with a facilitator, working on your script, helping you think about your image selection, helping you polish your video and all of that. So it just depends on the workshop, the group itself. Maybe we're looking at alphabetic literacy challenges or tech challenges. Maybe we're in communities where there's less facility with digital media tools. So we just adapt the workshop process and customize it for the group and for the outcomes that the organization or the group is looking for. So hopefully that answered really quickly your question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, part of it is there's a brevity to this. We know people's time is so 3 days can seem like a long time, but in the making and trying to distill an experience, it can sometimes feel like not enough time. So, there's a kind of economy of scale to this. And let's go through. I took out the slide that broke down. There are component parts, and maybe we'll talk about those. There's even a breakdown between those 5 main buckets of process, where how do we share a story? How do you get feedback? The idea that it is a group process. So the support is in other storytellers, other community members, other people that have signed up for the workshop, that they're there as your listening posts to give feedback, to make suggestions, to hold your hand, to maybe if they know the tech better, to sort of like say, do you need support with that? So we just facilitate a group that helps each other in the process. So, and there's many ways that we do that. But how do we get people to reflect? And this is sort of leading towards, because we want to make sure that we have time for this ethical component, which is really, really important in the work we do, and I think the work that you all do. But we want to make sure that what we're centered on, even though we do something called digital stories, these are digital artifacts, they're digital recording, that are sort of core technology, the way we have to be present in the room, going back to Charlie Barnaby, is listening. And that's our number one responsibility, I think, especially when we're from outsiders, when we're outside moving into a space, is we have to listen. Let me go through. Come on. And this is just a little slide saying that there's something beautiful in the brevity. We know that these individuals and communities have long, deep histories. James was expressing sort of in the land acknowledgements, this idea that there's generations and time immemorial of stories and learning and knowledge. How do we get people to sort of sit in an experience in a way of expressing that? And there's something about economy of scale. These aren't documentary films. We are all beautiful amateurs, but there's something really, really powerful in the sort of in the brevity of what people are saying, and what they decide to say is the important thing and the thing they want to express, which is leading us to this wonderful example of an incredibly short story that goes really deep. I think you'll all agree. So let me watch that, and then we'll continue through. Here we go.
These are some of the first films ever recorded. Thomas Edison chose these. These he thought we should see, but should be captured in motion. There's a beautiful kind of noise to them. Something old, something lost. What you're seeing here is the ghost dance. But they're not dancing it. Not really. This was 4 years after the Wounded Knee Massacre, which happened as a result of the ghost dance. The dancers here are performing as actors in a practiced ghost dance act, having joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. They're performing their Indianness. We keep wanting to see it that way. Indians dressed as Indians, the way we want them to be Indians. Head-dressed, historical, long gone. They don't want to see us here. Now. They want to look away, look forward. But it all just keeps looking like the past again. Backward. I don't know how to be anymore. I know that it matters to look, to see. These coming years might come like a cancer. I wonder what and all that we've captured. I wonder who and what will make it through. What will disappear? And what will we decide to keep?
Yeah, let that story sit. Comments in the chat. There was a date on the credits, so why this story now? There was a particular action that Tommy was wanting to tap into and support. What did you see? And what did you hear? How did you feel? What makes it powerful, James? Where does that power come from? In just the experience of watching. Is it what the story's about? How the story is told? What we are looking at? What we're listening to? These are why these stories are important. They're more than just the words. We engage in them. We don't look at these stories, we watch them. We wonder where Tommy's taking us. We wonder where the Thunder of Who's is leading us. Where is the story going? Where does the storyteller want us to, where are they taking us and where are they leaving us at the end of 2 minutes or 2.5 minutes, as the case of Tommy's story? And we're left with something. The writer Thomas King talks about it. Don't tell me you would have said it. You'd have told a different story if you'd only had heard the story by Tommy Orange, because you've heard it now. So this idea that these stories, and Tommy's or any of these stories, are kind of like gifts. They're these miniature little talismans that we now take forward, right? When I watch Tommy's story, and I've seen it many times, it changes how I move through space. It changes maybe my previous biases to land acknowledgements and all of that. Because I've heard Tommy's story and it's made stop me in my tracks and I have to think about it. That's the power of these stories. Where does that come from? And Tommy was a facilitator with us for a while, so he knew this sort of procedure, what we call the 7 steps. And I'm not going to go through them too much, just to lay them out there. That we want people that in telling their stories has come from their own sense of knowing and choosing the knowing that they decide to tell. whether it's with the details or lesser than that. But they decide what the story to tell, the experience they want to express. And they usually decide it because it's a story that's really meaningful to them. It's where they learned something, or they got hurt, or they had a triumph. So it's an emotional story because we learn through mistakes, we learn through our triumphs. And those are emotional moments. So the stories typically carry the weight of the learned experience, and we celebrate that. We don't want people to shy away from the power of their learning. We also, these stories are brief. We can't tell life histories. This is important, but the accumulation of these stories can start to put together life histories or community history. So we get people to go into that reflecting of time and place. When was that experience? When did you experience that? Who was in the room? What was going on? When was it? In the sense of, was it last week? Was it 10 years ago? How were things then and how are they now? So they're now thinking in memory, time, and place, because all our experiences happen somewhere and at some time. And there's usually something else going on. It's cold, it's hot, someone walked into the room. We want people to express it through their voice. We want them to hear their voice saying the words that are meaningful to them as the storyteller. And we know that that can be difficult. And we're not comfortable with the sound of our own voices. And we don't feel that we're empowered to speak for others. And these are just things that people work through the process to get close to some kind of understanding and some comfort within themselves to be expressive. Of course, the seeing your story, what you want to see. Tommy uses the archival footage and news media footage, right? We never sometimes see the storytellers. We don't see Edith in her story about working with youth. We just hear her. She wants us to see the people that are in her view. And then they all have to put it together. So part of the workshop is they have the tools in front of them. We're just the support mechanism to help them with whatever decisions they want to make and putting it together. And then there's the sharing of the story. And that's usually at the end of the workshop. But here we are sharing them outside of the context of the workshop. And these are just moving through the bits and pieces. Oops, didn't want to do that. Let's watch one more that came out of a public workshop. Tommy's came out of a workshop. There were other people in the room that had no connection to who Tommy was or didn't know Standing Rock even existed, and there was something going on there. Same with Lois Edge's story. So sometimes these stories come out because a beautiful bolt from the blue, and actually in the context of the workshop, create an information and sharing and learning right within the workshop. So here's this one.
I found my way to the south entrance of the Pitt Rivers Museum and asked for Dr. Laura Peers, Curator and Professor, Institute of Social and Cultural Anthropology, University of Oxford. I have come from Canada to visit with my grandmother's moccasins. They were purchased by the Hudson's Bay Company and donated to the Pitt Rivers Museum in 1942. My grandmother, Joanne Edge, is buried together with my grandfather, Albert Edge, at Fort Smith, Northwest Territories. Dr. Peers welcomes me to the museum. We set up a schedule of weekly meetings. At the first visit, I am escorted through a series of 3 locked doors. I must wear white cotton gloves. It is quiet in the visiting researcher room. I can hear the jingle of keys held by staff walking by in the hallway. Dr. Peers places a box on the table. Inside, nestled in tissue, are the moccasins. I inhale. Only a faint wisp of the strong scent of smoked moose hide lingers. I immediately recognize the moccasins as my grandmother's work. They are the wraparound kind, and they're folded wrong. I gently lift the tops, wrap the laces around each ankle, and carefully tie a double knot so they won't come undone. I am compelled to tell Dr. Piers everything that has happened in our family since my grandmother passed away in 1991. I can see her hands, hear scissors cutting, needle piercing thick hide, thread pulled through each stitch. I sense her energy. It lingers, still. The young students at Oxford ask me, have I come to take the moccasins home? I reply that British legislation does not allow for repatriation. There is comfort knowing my grandmother's moccasins are at the Pitt Rivers Museum. They will be here, safe. I am surprised to realize I must return to visit. When I get home, I say every day was brilliant.
Move 3. I've seen that story many times in the context of this presentation. I'm just thinking of storytelling as place, as knowing, and as sharing. And I just thinking of all the learning in that story, even down to how you're supposed to wrap the moccasins, the wraparound kind, and the mistakes, and the beautiful, unjudgmental way that she corrects that error. And then just the learning of I don't know. I'm thinking of a break. Let's put this up. We can all, but that would just, we're
I think
down.
we're already about 5 minutes behind, Rob. So maybe if people don't mind, we could.
Yeah, at this point, we're getting close to 15 minutes behind. So if folks need to step away for a minute or two, we completely understand, but it might be good if we can just keep pushing forward.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jenna. Okay. So I don't necessarily, this is just something if we had time, but we don't. But as we move forward in just this is talking about, we're going to talk about ethics here now. And we want this to be interactive because I think all of you will have a stake in this idea of ethical storytelling. Right, so we started with the land acknowledgement. There's certain processes and certain ways of being in space and research. As a researcher, who are you beholden to? Is it the IRB? Is it the foundation? Is it where the money comes from? How do we reconcile with the considerations of the community? So we don't have to answer this, but a lot of our learning, and I know that Alice and I would both agree that a lot of our learning in doing story work has come from mistakes, right? From where we've had to either not apologize, atone to something misspoken in a workshop or in a relationship with somebody in community, going back to the Charlie Barnaby story and others. So just always when you're thinking about, right, who are you in this idea of ethics, not necessarily others, but our role inside of this idea of an ethical practice. We will make sure that you all get a copy of a link, and maybe Allison, if you want to try and find it really quickly, sorry, I should have asked you, to our, this little 12-page document that is our ethical guidelines, our principles. I'm just going to put them out there. So we're just going to go through this very quickly. We won't do breakouts. We'll just sort of see if we can gather ideas, questions, concerns in the chat, given that we watch stories. We very quickly went through a particular process that we do to allow those stories to emerge out of a process. So here they are in its very short forms, and we'll go through them a little bit more detail. That our first one is ethical, the storyteller's well-being. First and foremost, we are in space, in a room, in a community, and people are there to work with us with them. How are we taking care of them? We want to make sure that consent at any given time, when people agree to be in that room with us, as safe as it is, things change day to day. And that consent, the agreements that are from day one may change halfway through day one. And we need to be light on our feet and ready to acknowledge that consent is a process. We want to make sure that at any given time in a workshop, there's a clarity of ownership. We want to ensure local relevance. And I'll talk about that. That's very important. That ethics overall is a process. So just if they're chiseled in stone, usually that's where we get in trouble. And what do we mean by sharing? And what's the ethical considerations around distribution? So let's dig into these a bit. Some of these stories are emotional. Some of them there's some ones that we'll share that were a little more lighthearted, but we know that people put energy and consideration and put themselves into the space to be expressive. And so we want to make sure that we are acknowledging that. And so we want to make sure that people feel attended to. There's food in the room, there is breaks, there is we're listening, we're greeting people at doors. It's not a classroom, it's a community environment. Even our workshops are more like kind of an art studio where people can get messy. Yes, computers, sure, let's have coffee. If coffee is being served and it's done this way, then that's how we do it. We also want to make sure that we don't seem as like, here I am I'm aware that I've done pretty well all the talking, right? There's an awareness that who's at the front of the room, who are they representing, right? What do they look like? Who do they identify as? And all of that, and how do people see them? So we have to be aware of that. So there's always an attention to the well-being. People can leave when they want to leave. If they're having a hard, they just said, this isn't for me. We don't try and convince them or cajole them into staying. There's always keeping people informed. How long it's going to be, how many people are going to be there, who else is going to be there, right? The things that they agreed upon, right? And in public workshops, what they paid their hard-earned money for. Right? They want assurances from us. Allison,
it's also kind of an ongoing, it's an iterative process. There's a lot of upfront information, especially when you're working with an organization, letting people know like why we're making these stories, how we hope to share them, who we hope will see them. And then we talk about it throughout the workshop, because people are making choices about whether to show their face or whether to use their name or what kinds of details they're going to tell that might, put them in danger in some cases. And so there's that. And then there's at the end, a release form, a traditional consent form, and we talk about it again, but we always, even still years later, if we're going to show something at a big event where we decide we want to do a playlist or a social media campaign, even though we have maybe that consent form and they've checked all the boxes, yes, you can show it in all these contexts, we still reach out and say, hey, we're thinking about doing this. Are you still okay with that? Because things change, as Rob said. And sometimes people come back and say, yeah, I'm looking for a job. And now when people Google me, my story that I made when I was 18 comes up and I would like for you to take it down. And so, we do. So just that ongoing idea of consent, I think, is pretty important.
Mm-hmm.
Not a one-off.
All through the process is these are not the affirmation, these are not our stories. We don't know the circumstances and the situations of the people making the stories. They have that experience, that there's reasons why they, as Allison said, want to show a picture or not, even if my aesthetic says that doesn't make sense. It makes sense to them, and we honor their own meaning making through this, right? And they own every step of the way. Now they might say, I want you to help. I mean, they can decide how much influence they want and how much that they want us to sidle up next to them and talk them through some things, because I don't know what picture to put in here. I don't know if I'm saying the right thing. What do you think? Or how do you hear this? And, one of our jobs is to be, well, from where I sit, if it were my story, and we often will say that, if it were my story, I might consider this. And they can say, well, that's if it was your story, but it's not. And that usually gives them a sense of, oh, now I know why I have to do what I have to do, because Rob said he'd do it this way, but I realize it's my story, so I have to do it that way. So there's facilitative techniques that we have that allow people to always stay, quote unquote, in the driver's seat. Local relevance, right? In the sense of who's in the room, who is leading the process. This is a tricky one sometimes because, right, just even having the expertise of facilitating a workshop, right? But in this sort of shared space, part of how we organize these workshops, especially in community, is like defer to a different type of leadership model, a different type of who actually opens the land acknowledgement. Right? There's ways that you do it that it's best to sit back and let others who have certain authority in those communities, and how those authorities are determined is somewhat have to be in discussion, but the local relevance is important. I was telling James a story when I was doing a workshop with the Native American Health Center in East Oakland, and it was with urban indigenous youth. And I was the first facilitator on site, and youth were coming in and 14 and 15 years old. And I heard them distinctly as they walked in. They saw me setting up the projector. Oh, he's so old. And I don't take that personally. Yes, in that context, it's like we didn't have anyone else, right? But thankfully, Tommy Orange, who you saw his story, was my co-facilitator. He came in about 5 minutes later, and all was right again. And I had a particular role in that workshop, which was different than I might have been if it was people like that of my ilk, right? So there's just really important that we are paying attention to how people respond to the person who's supposed to be the facilitator. And one of the ways to do that is we don't assert an expertise, we're there as a support. So sometimes having me as the person, which in the case of the workshop with Tommy Orange, I was the one making coffee. I was the one setting out the snacks. My role was to be really supportive in the wings, so to speak. So that was really, really important. And that's just the way you do it. At least we do it. This idea of a continual process in certain foundations, certain institutions, there's legalese, there's a certain way, and in grant proposals, and that's not my expertise per se, but I have been involved enough to know that there's certain things that there's the rule of the law, so to speak. But in our workshops, knowing that what's outside that room, but there's agreements that we have to agree inside that room. So we always do group agreements and how to do sort of restorative justice. How do we, if something is missaid, how do we repair that? And who's the responsible parties, and all of that stuff has to be there in some context. It doesn't happen all the time, but we know that if we just make up some rules, enter the room, that's not going to fly. The one anecdote is when I was supporting a workshop in a Métis community in Alberta, the person changed their research model from photo voice to digital storytelling. Through that, she had to go completely back to a full ethics review board. After 2 years of preparing for all this, it was her home community, and she was devastated that she had to spend this extra time. The community members, the elders, said, "When is that meeting?" And they came to the meeting. And they changed that. So they agreed to allow her to follow through because there was a higher power. And they saw that and they recognized that, and they came to the ethics review board meeting with Yvonne, and she was able to change her methodology to digital storytelling, and it was a success story. But it had to be, she couldn't work if she had to sort of go by the laws of the university. So she She didn't ask, they told her, we will do this for you. And finally, distribution. As Allison alluded to, this is getting to be a trickier and trickier space in the online world. These stories cannot always stand on their own. We turn our comments off on our YouTube channel, and we sacrifice quote unquote clicks and all of that because the storyteller's not there to contextualize their story. Sometimes these stories need contextualization. They need a framework of the research questions. They need a framework of the actual place and space and all of the sort of data that surrounds that to allow those stories to not always do the heavy lifting. They provide beautiful insights at a very, very personal, emotional level of sort of embodied knowledge, but they don't always hold up to scrutiny of researchers or academic sort of whatever people use in those worlds to verify, the verification of that story, or what is the real truth, and right, empirical versus sort of more tacit sort of knowing. And so we have to be careful that we're not putting these stories at harm's way, and that the storyteller's story is not honored in the way it was honored in the workshop, and maybe when it was honored by the community screening, or even in the original intent of the research. It's now out there, and it's there for attacks and reprisals. So we need to be very, very concerned about these things. And these things all of these principles are brought to discussion when a project is being even planned, right? So people need, they don't just learn about digital storytelling by walking into a room with Allison and I. There's been discussions, there's been recruitment, there's particular ways that people need to be present and available, right? We don't want to take people away from their more important things in their lives if that's going to make them say, that I can't finish. And if we chose somebody or someone who was selected and they had more pressing matters, they might feel like they've missed out on this chance that they failed somebody, and we can't have that. So this idea of distribution and responsibility doesn't end when the workshop ends. It has to be carried through beyond that. How are we doing? This is sort of a summation. And I think we have time to, and I think that's it. So.
Rob, I think a few people may be wrong, but might have some questions about specifics in research.
So maybe we can just go specifics around the ethics and see if anything sort of reflects back into our process and this idea of where these stories sit in the sense of knowledge, of place, and other ways of knowing. So and I'll just leave these questions up that maybe that'll spark some other questions. So let's open it up for the next 10 minutes.
I had a question, really researcher related earlier. I don't know if that's what you were referencing, Allison.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm Julie Rizian. I'm at Oregon State, and I do a lot of faculty development. And one of the challenges is the work of telling stories. So telling stories is often such an opportunity to be able to do it thoughtfully, but it's not always something that people have time to be doing. Mm-hmm. And yet those stories are no less important. And so in guiding faculty, I give them a lot of details about be careful to tell the story from your own point of view and your own experience. Also, be safe. Don't tell something that's highly personal if it doesn't feel safe to you in the audience. But I struggle with this idea of bringing powerful stories of rights holders and other communities of interest to the table when you're trying to kind of incite investment and engagement in research without appropriating and without saddling your partners with a bunch of extra work. So I'm curious if you could speak to that a little.
Yeah, Rob, is that okay if I?
Okay. Yes, please do.
Yeah, so so probably all of the work that I do is in collaboration with partners. Like I work with a lot of faculty. I also partner with them on writing research grants sometimes to fund that those sorts of projects. And I think just in terms of how are you engaging your community, I think there are a lot of ways to do it. I'm going to give you an example. This one's in public health, but I think it translates. I do some work with the Mayo Clinic around in public health, and they do a lot of CBPR, so the community-based participatory research. And so a project that I worked with them on was with Somali community members, refugee and immigrants from Spanish-speaking countries. And so, because it came from the community and they engaged Mayo, so that's a different thing than what you're talking about, but they were engaged throughout, even including, thinking about the methodology, how are we going to do this? What are the kinds of stories that we're looking for? How are we going to recruit? How are we going to find people in the community that have the stories to tell? And then, how are we going to analyze the data, and how are we going to share these? And that was part of it. Theirs was researching how the stories impact viewers, and does it, and measuring kind of the health behavior changes on people who've watched the stories. And if people want to know more specifics about those kinds of things, you're welcome to follow up with me later. But in terms of how to, like working with faculty and they're doing community projects, I think part of it is being as mindful as possible and collaboratively designing the research and engaging your community. I mean, we always encourage people build in stipends, they build in daycare, they build in lots of things. And then we modify, like for us, we modify the workshop depending on who the group is and what kinds of, time. But I think also making it really clear for participants what they get out of it, and depending again on what your goals are. I mean, a lot of people, it's part of a capacity building. It can be part of leadership development, building a cohort of engaged community members that then become leaders and advocates around the issue, or the campaign, an anti-stigma campaign, or understanding health in a community. So I think a lot of that goes into the design. And you're not asking your researchers to tell the stories because because they can't, they're not their stories to tell, but how do you, engage the communities in different ways to tell their own stories? And it doesn't have to be this full-fledged, full digital stories. There are also, ways you can, of course you do focus groups, you do things like that, but you can do writing, you can do audio pieces, you can do it through photo voice.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, certainly when you're doing community-based participatory type research, that's all very baked in from the front end. But so many researchers are themselves not attached, but it's still, I think, really important to reflect on why it's important to spend the money and the resources to study the thing that impacts people. And I always, myself as a researcher, I'm on that side of the spectrum of always being more co-developed, but that's not appropriate in a lot of disciplines, right? Because there's a fine line between co-development and making people work for you, and I don't want to get too in the philosophy of that, but I think we sometimes confound collaboration or with like division of labor almost. So that's probably a more cynical way to say it than is necessary. So I think that's the challenge, is being able to tell a story about a community to whom your research really matters in an authentic way, without asking people to do work. And especially at the proposal stage, right? When the chances of having funding often is 5% or less, right? So okay, but that helps. Thanks.
And I'll just add, one of the best ways that we've had successes, and Allison will concur, is people have taken a workshop. Pretty well all those stories have come from, like Lois Edge came to a public workshop, they've come to the workshop and they have then taken that knowledge and thought through it themselves of how they want to do that in their research. So they actually come and just participate in a public workshop. It's just very strange. And that actually sets them up for success, because if there's a cohort that have had an experience, then the researcher's not working in isolation to try and convince somebody. You're sort of coming from a sort of more set up for success. It's just one way that we've seen the benefit of just having a researcher have an individual experience. Then they have to think about, how am I going to take that into the communities that I'm working with? The thing that I've experienced and all the sort of insecurities and nervousness, right? Knowing the community I'm trying to support, you have a better sort of sense from walking through the process yourself. Does that make sense? How's that for a sales pitch?
Julie, I love your question too. And one thing that I like to ask, the question I like to ask is like, what's in it for them? What's in it for
That's what I
them
was
to
trying
tell
to
their
get at.
story?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thinking of ways to bring in like, I don't know, celebrity filmmakers to teach workshops or give them cameras or, you know, provide honorariums for participation.
And even having them recognize, they start to see, they say, what would be good for me is if the youth can get some capacity, right?
Mhm.
Right. That there's right. And that's where I've had successes. We've had committees, you know, the Métis workshops I did in Fishing Lake, they had a group of elders in the community. They determined some of the parameters, who would be involved, right? Which youth would work with which elder in the community, because it was intergenerational. So they were making decisions because they had a particular outcome that they wanted. So yes, absolutely. What, you know, imagining what they could get out of it, but even having them imagine themselves and make recommendations from their perspective and see if we can meet them.
But I also find a lot of people, you know, I mean, there is all of the things like honorariums and, you know, all the kind of tangible things and capacity building. But I think a lot of people find, or at least in most of the different kinds of research projects that I've been involved in, people really want to have a say and they want to share their voice and they want their voice to matter. They want it to impact policy. They want it to, you know, they want to be represented. And so I think, I mean, the workshop experience itself is pretty magical. It's hard to explain it, but I still get letters and emails from people 15 years ago that say that workshop that I took is still, I still think about it. It was transformative. I still share my story. It really changed my life in certain ways. And that's not hyperbole. I think people find that sharing their story with other people from their community, whatever community that is, with the goal of deepening understanding around an issue and hopefully making a difference in some way with the outcome of the research, is compelling for a lot of people. And it, you know, again, asking them to do it, but they're choosing to do it if they understand kind of what's in it for them. Are there other questions, particularly about research or about any of the ethics or any other things that people
Anything about the stories?
Curious about?
Has anyone done any of this, story work in their communities?
I have a question, if you don't mind.
Of course.
So is it ever appropriate to tell someone else's story? And I'm thinking about a project where we have youth doing some interviewing and then sharing a story back, and wondering, if that seems as if there's a possibility there, that seems off track.
It's a great question. And just referring, I mean, in this one particular case, there is another level of decision about which youth would pair with what elder. So there was a sort of knowing in the community about the benefit to the youth of honoring the elder, and the elder having a vested interest in that youth. So that was just one way of navigating that to allow it became an intergenerational story that was shared in they worked together collectively to, right? There was a vested interest in the pairing of those two. I think the one thing is you want to have students not just doing it as an assignment for the youth, but there's a sort of a sense of when they're interviewing, and I've done this, is what they've learned from that person, right? So it's not necessarily an oral history or sort of documentation of that one, but they have to, and that's what was successful in the Fishing Lake model, is the students learned things about that person, and they went, wow, I didn't know that old Joe was, had this person in the community when he was my age, right? And so they told the story of that other person, but through their own eyes and their own experiences of being in the room with them. And I think that is one way of doing it. And I just think, why is this youth telling this person's story? And certainly in the community context, there's a particular knowing, but why this person should be telling this person's story. And I think you need to open up a little bit to that rather than just saying, go tell this story about this person. Because then they'll say, why is that person doing this telling?
Thank you. And so kind of coupled with what Allison said. So that's kind of the approach that we have, Allison, and that the youth are kind of gathering feedback, but ultimately they're putting it together, and that was kind of where I was concerned that was that really the elders telling the story, if you know what I mean, because the youth end up kind of putting the pieces together.
Yeah, it's wonderful to watch that relationship build where the students feel they want to honor that story and they want to do their best job of producing that story just for that person that they've been in conversation with. And then the elders like, wow, you're so good. Like there's beautiful connections. So yeah, a lot of those stories, the elders are like their hands
Thank you.
off and the youth will do the production part. Yeah.
Thank you.
Julie, I would just wanted to say something that you, this idea about asking a community partner to share. We need always to be transparent about the environment the story will circulate in. I 100% agree. And that's a huge part of for me, when working with partners, just all of the planning, and before you recruit, I help people develop their recruiting materials, and you have to talk about what is digital storytelling, why are we doing it, what is this project for, how, what do we hope the research will accomplish, who's going to see the stories and why. And I offer for all of my partners, once we've developed the recruiting materials, sometimes they do an application process, there's lots of different ways. And I always do an information session where people who are just curious, who want to know more about it, can come and meet me. And, I talk about the agenda. We talk about the purpose of the project. We show a couple of stories. We answer questions and ask, they get to ask whatever they want, and they're making a decision. It's like they're being invited and they're making a decision about whether or not it's something that they want to participate in and why. And so I found that to be a really helpful part of the process as well.
Jenna, I'm just aware of time, and people have been so gracious of giving us full 90 minutes. So I know that the survey is important. We want to make sure it's 2 minutes. I think, Jenna, you can set it up for Anne.
I think it's already in the chat.
And Allison and I will wait through the survey. And if anyone wants to stick around and have a little bit more informal, we can stop the recording or however you want to do it. And Jenna or James. And I don't mind staying till 1:45.